Titanic true story. How much of the movie is real? James Cameron's Titanic is based on the real-life sinking of the infamous ship of the same name, but how much of the movie actually happened? Titanic continues to be one of the most impressive cinematic achievements and a story that viewers constantly revisit, but how much of the movie actually happened? James Cameron became a widely known and respected name in the film industry thanks to the Terminator and Terminator 2. Judgment Day, but he drew a lot more attention in 1997 with Titanic, a romance disaster movie based on the accounts of the sinking of the RMS Titanic in 1912, which was his biggest and most ambitious project up to that point. Titanic told the story of Rose DeWitt Bukater, Kate Winslet, and Jack Dawson, Leonardo DiCaprio, two passengers from different social classes who fell in love aboard the famous ship during its ill-fated maiden voyage. Titanic was a big success with both critics and viewers, becoming the highest-grossing movie ever at the time, later surpassed by Cameron's Avatar in 2010, and then by Marvel's Avengers. Endgame, and was praised for its visuals and performances, though some criticized Rose and Jack's love story. Still, Titanic has a special place in the hearts of fans and continues to be one of Cameron's best works. Although Titanic is based on the real-life sinking of the ship and even added some real-life characters, not everything in the movie actually happened, and Cameron had to either change, add, or embellish some details to fit the story he wanted to tell. Here's how much of James Cameron's Titanic is real. The real-life inspiration behind Rose. Although Titanic's main characters Rose and Jack were entirely fictional, thus there was no such romance between a first-class woman and a third-class man, they were inspired to an extent by some real-life people, though Rose's inspiration has no connection to the Titanic. As revealed by Cameron, American artist Beatrice Wood was the inspiration behind Rose, as Cameron was reading her autobiography during Titanic's development. Wood was a painter, sculptor, writer, and actress who came from a family of wealthy socialites. Cameron has said that, as he was reading Wood's book, he realized it described almost literally the character of old Rose, and the movie's Rose is only a refraction of Beatrice, combined with many fictional elements. Surely, Rose and Beatrice Wood have some similarities, as are their love of art and their wealthy family background, but Wood had no connection with the Titanic. As for Jack, he wasn't inspired by anyone, but his name is very similar to that of a man who was on board the Titanic. A man who signed as J. Dawson was a passenger of the Titanic, but the J stood for Joseph, not Jack, and he was born in Dublin. Joseph Dawson was no regular passenger, and he was actually part of the ship's crew, working as a coal trimmer. Cameron didn't know there was a Joseph Dawson until after the script was finished, so Jack's name being similar to that of Joseph was a mere coincidence. Joseph Dawson's grave received a lot of visitors after Titanic was released, who left cinema stubs, pictures of Leonardo DiCaprio, and more, as they believed it was the resting place of Jack Dawson. The real Molly Brown. Conscious of its spiritual and moral heritage, the Union is founded on the indivisible, universal values of human dignity, freedom, equality and solidarity. It is based on the principles of democracy and the rule of law. It places the individual at the heart of its activities by establishing the citizenship of the Union and by creating an area of freedom, security and justice. When the Titanic hit the iceberg and began to sink, Margaret helped other passengers board the lifeboats and had to be persuaded to leave the ship in a lifeboat number 6. Once there, she urged that the lifeboat went back to save more people, but the crewmen opposed. Margaret threatened to throw the crewmen overboard, and sources vary as to whether they returned and if they found anyone alive. Once in the RMS Carpathia, the ship that rescued the Titanic survivors, Margaret organized a survivors committee to secure basic necessities for the second and third class survivors. Due to her actions, the media named her Unsinkable Molly Brown, and she passed away in 1932 at the age of 65. The Titanic really hit an iceberg. Of course, the sinking of the Titanic after hitting an iceberg really happened. On April 14, 1912, at 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the crew spotted an iceberg and alerted the bridge. First Officer Willem Murdoch ordered the ship to be steered around the iceberg and the engines to be stopped, but there wasn't enough time, and the starboard side of the ship hit the iceberg. The hit created a series of holes below the waterline, and though the hull was not punctured, it was dented and allowed water to seep in. As depicted in the movie, pieces of the iceberg landed on the promenade deck, according to survivors. The crew was not prepared for an emergency of this magnitude, and as ships were seen as pretty much unsinkable back then, Titanic only had enough lifeboats to carry half the passengers on board. The crew didn't know how to properly carry out an evacuation either and launched many lifeboats barely half full, with third-class passengers left behind and causing many of them to become trapped below decks as the ship continued to fill with water. A little over 2.5 hours after Titanic hit the iceberg, the boat deck dipped underwater and the sea poured in through open hatches and grates, and as its unsupported stern rose out of the water, the ship broke into two pieces. The Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m., and most of the remaining passengers and crew were immersed in freezing water, dying within 15 to 30 minutes. As seen in the movie, the lights continued to burn until just before the ship went under, and as recalled by a survivor, a series of terrific explosions occurred, probably from the boilers. The wreckage of the Titanic was found on September 1, 1985, during an expedition led by Jean-Louis Michel and Robert Ballard, who discovered that the ship had in fact split apart, as it was long believed it sunk in one piece. The band continued playing. One of the most memorable moments from Titanic is the string quartet playing as the ship began to sink. In real life, the band did continue to play, but it's unclear which was the last song they played. Survivors reported the band played Alexander's Ragtime Band and In the Shadows, and newspapers shared the final song was Nearer, My God, to Thee, while survivors said it was Song Autumn. The elderly couple. Another unforgettable and heartbreaking moment is the elderly first-class couple who decided to stay on the ship and embraced in bed as their room filled with water. The couple was Macy's owner Isidore Strauss and his wife Ida, and they were offered a place on lifeboat number 8, but Isidore chose to stay on board as long as there were women on the ship. Ida refused to leave her husband, and according to witnesses, Ida told him, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting on a pair of deck chairs, which witnesses described as a most remarkable exhibition of love and devotion, and only Isidore's body was recovered. Passengers were rescued from the water as seen in Titanic. 2 of the 16 lifeboats returned to pick up survivors from the water, but the shock and more were too much for some, and they died on the boats. The boats that returned were Lifeboat 4, led by Quartermaster Purkis, who reportedly pulled 5 people from the water, of which only 3 survived, and Lifeboat 14, headed by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, played by Ian Grufford in Titanic, who with the help of a working crew of 6 men, picked up 4 people from the water. The Carpathia rescued the survivors at around 4 a.m. on April 15. The Titanic survivors were rescued by the Carpathia, and the bodies of those who died on the lifeboats overnight were left on the boats and recovered some time later. Carpathia was bound for Fiume, Austria-Hungary, now Rijeka, Croatia, but as it didn't have the stores nor medical facilities to look after the Titanic survivors, it changed its course and returned to New York, so survivors could be properly looked after. Many of the Titanic survivors lived for many more years, while others succumbed to shock and other problems and died weeks after the disaster.